Well, thank you, both of you. It's tremendous talent to be able to synthesize major concepts in such a short period of time, and I have read the testimony, and it's very instructive. Let me, my concern, I hear the whole question of unilateral. I always prefer multilateral sanctions when we can get it. I prefer not to have sanctions if we don't even need that in order to achieve our goals. If diplomatic discourse can ultimately lead us to a point where we can negotiate an agreement that is acceptable, obviously that's desirable as well. But looking at Russia's history here with Georgia, Moldova, and now the Ukraine, at some point, and I think you may have alluded to this by saying we may have to go first. At some point, if there is to be no significant arming of the Ukrainian military so that the challenges of taking them, the Russians trying to take them on are further exacerbated. Dr. Brzezinski has already said they'll fight tooth and nail the Ukrainians, especially in urban centers, and that would be a concept that no Russian leader could fathom doing, but this would enhance that possibility. Also, if we are not to, at the end of the day, pursue any sanctions because the Europeans are unwilling to, what is it to stop Putin from continuing on a course of destabilization, not invasion, but destabilization? And what is it that sends him a message that the next place that he picks he's free to do so, because at the end of the day he'll get condemnation but no other consequences? Either one of you, I'm happy to.
Well, Mr. Chairman, let me just
if you
make
put your
comment.
button on your microphone.
Let me just comment briefly one point. Where did my colleague here? What? It's on.
Okay, now it's on.
Let me briefly make one comment on your observation regarding the NATO issue. I think there's a misunderstanding here. I make it very clear that NATO membership can be forsaken. The Ukrainians are not asking for it. A large proportion of the Ukrainian people don't want to be in it. And in any case, if it were to transpire that there is an accommodation, I think in that context, it would be possible to negotiate it with the Ukrainians not being promised or having door open for them in the future regarding NATO. One can, I think, understand the Russian concerns here. If one looks at the map, NATO membership would jut a large new area deep into what traditionally has been the Russian Empire and create an altogether new geopolitical situation, which I cannot see the Russians ever accepting unless there is a significant accommodation of larger sense. And that's all I had in mind. On the question of the arms, my view is that we should be very open about it and not secretive. If the Ukrainians need arms for their defense, we should be willing to provide them, although in a manner which doesn't provide for a capacity of the Ukrainians to undertake offensive actions. The Russians would exploit any transfer of arms to the Ukrainians as a threat to their security. If we are very deliberate in terms of what we convey to the Ukrainians, we can enhance their capacity, particularly to defend their cities, and make the attempt to occupy any large cities by the Russian armed forces prohibitively expensive. And that would have then political consequences of a prolonged conflict, financial consequences internationally, mobilization of public opinion internationally against Russia, which I think would make any rational Russian government think twice of that option.
Mr. Chairman, I think sanctions are an important element of a comprehensive policy, and at some point we may have to go out ahead to lead by example as a way to bring the Europeans along. But I think we must focus equally on the other elements of a comprehensive strategy that over the long term are going to be more important in reducing Putin's leverage and his ability to pursue these kinds of activities. Completing the TTIP negotiations have been talked about. Developing a joint transatlantic energy strategy that reduces the EU's dependence on Russian oil and gas, resuming an open door to accession to the European Union, the United States recommitting to the security of Europe in word and deed by some of our deployments and exercises, revitalizing the NATO alliance, get Europeans to make more of a commitment and to refocus on the core mission of preserving and protecting the security of Europe, helping the nations that are subject to Russian pressure to build self-defense forces, and finally helping Ukraine succeed as a democratic, prosperous country able to provide security and prosperity for its people. Those long-term commitments are what are really going to eliminate the opportunities for Putin to make mischief in the future.
I appreciate that. Let me ask one last question. From the end of the Cold War, attempts have been made to draw Russia into the community of nations as a stable, prosperous, and democratic partner. But given Putin's high level of domestic support in recent polls, I guess there is some allure among Russians of the empire or power over other countries as being attractive. Could we have done things differently that would have changed the course of events, or was Putin's Russia inevitable? And what kind of policies would you advocate? And you were referring to keeping the door open, Mr. Hadley, that the U.S. and international community follow to encourage Russia to forsake imperial aspirations and to get back into an international order which they have upended by virtue of their invasion in Crimea and what they are doing in the Ukraine.
I think I mentioned you.
For both of you, I'd like to hear from both of you on this side.
Okay. I think basically, I think we have to maintain the policy that we have adopted in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is to create opportunities for Russia's closer association with the West, but without compromising our fundamental principles, and while entertaining the hope that over time, internal change in Russia will contribute to the gradual democratization of Russia itself. There is some evidence to indicate that this, in the longer run, is not only possible, but even probable. There is developing a Russian middle class, which increasingly thrives on essentially adopting as much as possible of the Western lifestyle and of connectivity with the West. It sends its children to the West. It travels to the West. It sends its money to the West, and perhaps that is most persuasive of all. Basically, a process is taking place, which is demonstrated by the scale of the social opposition, the demonstrations, the increasing number of commentators speaking up openly on this issue. And that is part of a process of change which one can cultivate. Putin's current moves are, in my judgment, a retrogressive aberration, connected very much with his personality, his previous institutional connections, in particular with the instruments of compulsion, perhaps a certain touch of megalomania on a personal level. And he appeals on that basis to those elements of Russian society which feel themselves vulnerable, which are very nationalistic, which are susceptible to chauvinistic appeals. And we saw exactly that manifesting itself in the wake of the seemingly very easy so-called, quote-unquote, triumph in Crimea. But the crisis with Ukraine, I think, is beginning to send signals, particularly to the more intelligent, internationally minded parts of the Russian elite, that Russia is being drawn into something that could prove utterly debilitating to Russia itself. And this is why, in the longer run, I anticipate that there will be some inclination to experiment, to check out, to investigate the possibility of some sort of an accommodation once it dawns not only on the Russian elite itself, but increasingly maybe on Mr. Putin himself, that a policy of violence, either selective or all out, is in the long run not the road to success, but a guarantee of Russia as a basket case economically and politically.
Sure.
I agree very much with what Dr. Brzezinski has said. Putin views himself as a strong leader who wants to return to Russian greatness. But he has a definition of Russian greatness, I would say, is 19th century. It's sort of a new neo-Russian empire. We have to show him that whatever his short-term tactical successes involve a long-term strategic loss. And the real future for Russia as a secure and prosperous state is going to be not on 19th century principles, but on 21st century principles. And we need to therefore deter him from his 19th century agenda and leave the door open for those who want Russia to actually have a 21st century role and path for a secure and prosperous state.
Thank you both. Senator Corker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. We always appreciate having distinguished national security advisors here and appreciate your comments. And Dr. Brzezinski, when you say accommodation in answering the last question, an accommodation to Russia, to once the elite, the thinking of the elites permeates the rest of society or Putin, what kind of accommodation would that be?
Well, are we talking specifically in your question about Ukraine or more generally?
Specifically relative to Ukraine.
Well, it seems to me that increasingly it is a fact and no longer a speculation that Ukraine as an independent state is going to be moving towards the West. That is the predominant predisposition of the Ukrainian people. I think the regime that has now emerged in Ukraine is genuinely democratic. It is determined to correct the errors of the last 20 years. And sad to say, over the last 20 years, Ukraine has been governed very badly.
Right.
And I think that it is evident to all concerned that the regimes that have dominated the political scene were self-serving, self-enriching, and not dedicated to Ukraine's well-being. This is now changing, in part to the challenge from the outside. The use of force against Ukraine by the Russians was a stunning experience for the Ukrainians. Historically, they have not been anti-Russian. But also over the last 20 years, they have started to enjoy the fruits of independence. And that's especially the case with the younger generation. And that younger generation asserted itself in the Maidan. And I think that increasingly defines Ukraine today. So the Russians will have to come to terms with that new reality. But otherwise, they'll embroil themselves in a prolonged adventure, which, as I've tried, and I think that increasingly defines Ukraine today. So the Russians will have to come to terms with that new reality. But otherwise, they'll embroil themselves in a prolonged adventure, which, as I've tried to stress, will be self-debilitating. So I am, on the whole, an optimist. I believe an accommodation is possible because the costs of imposing a unilateral solution by the Russians themselves are simply disproportionately high to the benefits that could be achieved thereby. They're beginning to learn this already in the case of Crimea. There was this exaltation when they occupied Crimea, liberation, reunification, all sorts of slogans. What is the reality 3 months later? Prices have risen 3 times. Tourists are not coming. They come every year on a scale of 6 million. Including great many from abroad. They're not showing up. They have difficulty even in getting there. Investments in Ukraine are very difficult to make the moment they involve any international deal, because the international community has not recognized the incorporation of Crimea, which means there will be endless legal suits connected with any kind of development in Ukraine, tourism, exploration for more energy, whatever. In brief, what seemed like a great success 3 months ago is now becoming, I think, increasingly a source of concern. And this is where I sort of feel more confident about what is happening. I'm frustrated that we haven't adopted the sanctions that we should. I'd like to see the Europeans act more decisively. I think we could too. But by and large, we're pointing in the right direction. And I think it's becoming more clear to more Russians that Putin is pointed in the wrong direction.
If I could, I know Hadley has to leave here soon, and I know Rubio wants to ask some questions. I'll just ask one more. One of the things that was most poignant to me on a recent trip was a comment I referred to in my opening comments, and that was a national security advisor in Eastern Europe, referring to the fact that if we allow Russia to continue with this bad behavior without the sanctions that I think most of you have alluded to, we in essence will accommodate a bitter peace. In other words, we return to business as usual. Nothing is really done about what's happened in Crimea and other places. Just since both of you have to think for the long haul and have done that within differing administrations, what are the risks there from your perspective over the longer haul? And that is a bitter peace with Russia where their actions have never been countered. They just kind of fester, if you will, in Eastern Europe.
You know, I think one of the things we're tripping over, the word accommodation, which suggests giving in to Russia. I'd rather talk in terms of outcomes. I think it is very important that Russia be seen and not to be able to succeed with what it is doing. And as I say, that Putin sees that, and the Russian people see that this 19th century nationalistic binge he has on them is not working for them. The outcome I think we want is in a Ukraine that if it decides to move west, join the EU and Western institution is able to do so, an outcome where Ukraine is prosperous and secure, an outcome where the Russian people within Ukraine can enjoy that security and prosperity, in which it is the Russians see that it is a Ukraine that is not against Russia, but is allowed to maintain its historical, economic, and historical ties with Russia. And I think that if that happens, the Russian people at some point are going to decide that maybe Ukraine is a better model for their future than this kind of nationalistic neo-Russian empire that Putin is talking about. That is the outcome, I think, we ought to be striving for here.
Thank you both for being.
Senator Rubio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. Thank you both for your service to our country over an extended period of time, both in government and outside. I appreciate your presence very much. Dr. Brzezinski, of course, your service to our country is well documented, although these days you're increasingly known as Mika's dad. And we watch you quite often in the morning. I wanted to ask you both, first, in the previous panel, and I know it was kind of simplistic in the way I described it, and I don't think it's inconsistent with anything you were saying, but in my mind, kind of the 5,000-foot view of what Putin is trying to pull off here is to reach a point where he has exorbitant influence over Kiev's foreign policy vis-a-vis its relationship to Russia. That's what we've all been talking about. And as I've described earlier, I think that involves the combination of support for separatists and the threat of military engagement on the one hand, and then these sort of things he's doing, calling for ceasefires and so forth to make himself appear as the reasonable conciliator and juxtaposed against an image he's trying to create that Kiev as the aggressor and so forth. And then I said that I thought, and this is where I hope your insight will be helpful, that within Moscow now and within the people making these decisions, I would venture to guess, obviously I don't know, but I would venture to guess, and I'm pretty certain that they themselves are kind of looking at this dynamic, and there's two opposing schools of thought. One group probably is pushing very hard for more aggressive action, and another group is probably saying, you know, but these sanctions are going to hurt our pocketbook and our ability to do things. Like this, I mean, we should not underestimate how important the Asian markets are going to be for Russia's future, short-term, quite frankly, ability to export energy. And in fact, the estimates are that Asia will become its leading export market. To do that, they've got to have the capacity. It means they've got to go and explore. I pointed to the fact that they're going to struggle in eastern Siberia because some of these gas deposits there have high amounts of helium, and that requires extensive work, and so they need access not just to financing, but some of the Western technology. What it leads me to is, as we view this dynamic, they're having this debate in Moscow about, we're worried about sanctions, but we also have this group that's pushing for more. And by the way, I would guess that despite all the assistance they're getting, some of these separatists probably feel like Moscow isn't doing enough. They want them to do more. So given all these pressures, it is my view that the best way to nudge it or to influence this in the direction we'd like to see it head is not simply to threaten sanctions, but to make very clear what those sanctions would look like so that it's not a guessing game about what will happen if they do this, that in fact they know for a fact what it would look like. And I know that the ideal scenario is that if we do it, others will join us in it. But my sense of it is that potentially the best way to ensure that is through American leadership, that if America is willing to, at least the American Congress is willing to graphically spell out what the specific consequences will be of specific actions, automatically, not what the President may decide to do, that it would strengthen our hand in that regard. I think, Mr. Hadley, in your testimony, you said we may be getting closer to that point anyway. So that was the question I asked of Secretary Nuland, and I was hoping that you would both expand. And then if time permits, I just had an issue related to Russia, but not directly to Ukraine. And it may seem like it's out of left field, but I'm curious, given the amount of knowledge that you both have about Russia, what do you think their response would be, given events in Iraq that have happened recently, if the Syrians asked the Russians to conduct airstrikes in Syria against ISIL? How open would they be to that sort of measure? And that's a separate question if we have time to get to them. But I really want to focus on this question of whether specific sanctions by Congress would further the direction of decision-making in Moscow.
I'd make 3 points. One, I think your description of his strategy is accurate, and it is very, very important that it be seen to fail. Because if it succeeds, he'll do it again elsewhere. You know, when he went into Georgia in 2008, we all said, today Georgia, tomorrow Crimea, and the day after the Baltics. Well, you know, he's 2/3 of the way there. So, one, it's important he failed. Two, I think it would be very useful, as I said in my opening comments, to have that kind of roadmap. If he takes these activities or fails to stop what he's doing, these are the kind of sanctions he would face. I think that would be a useful thing. I would hope, though, we, as much as possible, we could coordinate it with the Europeans so that Angela Merkel would be leading the Europeans so they would follow our roadmap. It doesn't say we don't do it without them, but it will be more effective if we can bring them along. Third,
Well, they're probably in a good mood in Germany after last night's game, so
yes,
we should
and
jump on that.
they may be even better after the finals. Third, I'll go back to what I said before. This is not only about sanctions, but if we are going to be effective against Putin's strategy, we need the other 6 or 7 items that I outline in my statement that are elements of a comprehensive, long-term approach to this problem. That's what we need. So sanctions, yes, but take a look at the other things and let's be moving out on the other elements of a comprehensive policy.
I agree with that. I agree very much with Mr. Hadley.
What's your view on if the Syrians asked the Russians to conduct airstrikes against ISIL in Syria, whether they would do that?
Well, the first question that would come to my mind immediately is, where would they stage it from? You know, they don't have the seaborne capability for air operations that we have. So it would have to be done in some fashion from Russian territory.
Or from Syrian territory that the Syrians
Or,
allow,
well, what facilities are really available for them on Syrian territory?
other than the seaport, the naval facility?
They would have to be secure, and they're probably very vulnerable, and they're probably not in very good shape. Now, would they be tempted to do it? I rather suspect not. I think the Russians want to avoid an entanglement with a whole host of issues that are being unleashed in the Middle East, and they much prefer us to become more entangled. And this is one of the reasons why I have been urging restraint on our part, because it seems to me that these are issues that are not likely to be solved entirely by the use of force. And that certainly we have already learned from both Afghanistan and Iraq that the use of force in these very complex ethnic, religious, national circumstances is a very, very costly and unpredictable undertaking.
It's a murky area, and press reports say that Russian Su-22s, I think, are flying strikes in Iraq. That's press reports. And it is unclear, are they flown by Iraqi pilots, by Russian pilots, or Iranian pilots? This is a murky and confused situation.
Well, thank you both for your insights and your expertise. It's always a tremendous value to the committee. This hearing will remain open to the close of business on Friday, and with the thanks of the committee, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you. I always enjoy the meeting. I enjoy the meeting. This is good. Yes. I hope it has some impact. But I'm not for, some sort of giveaway.